my name is Craigory, like they said. I'm talking about how we are working on Project Inference, and specifically how we're redefining projects in NX. So, why me? I'm a senior engineer on the NX core team. My focus since I joined has been on project configuration and how the plugins work. This specific area kind of merges those two focuses. So what is Project Inference? Inference is how NX reads your project configuration. This changed somewhat recently back in NX 13.3 through 14, and we came out with a version 2 very recently over the past 2 months. This is the backing mechanism for how package-based repos work. So they don't have project JSONs that represent the NX configuration as we know it. Instead, we read your package JSON and infer what that configuration would look like, hence the name. So after it was initially added for that, we added it as an experimental API the community plugins can extend. This is where nx.net comes in a little bit. So with nx.net, you're able to just have a CS project file, and NX will be able to read that and build a configuration. So why inference? These APIs are what make NX just work for existing repositories. So when you run NX init, you don't see massive sweeping changes necessarily. You don't see a lot of project JSON files. We can just read your existing configuration and run off that. Like I said, this is what handles initially just package JSON repos, but even loading configuration from project JSON now goes through these APIs. And community plugins like nx.net are able to make NX work without any additional configuration at all for non-JavaScript projects. So, like I said, we recently done a huge refactor on how these APIs work from what the V1 was to what we have now. Initially, inference was done with 2 properties, project file patterns and register project targets. These exports were, 1, a list of glob patterns that identified the configuration files in your project, and 2, a function that takes that file and converts it to a list of targets that NX knows how to run. There were several shortcomings with this. Specifically for Angular and .NET, a huge one is that those V1 APIs required that each configuration file only represented one project. So this meant we couldn't use inference for Angular.json support. We had to do that custom because you can have multiple projects in there. And for .NET, we couldn't use that for solution files. Additionally, the logic for finding projects and targets was decoupled into those 2 separate properties, so it increases some chances for things to go wrong. And there was no way to add metadata to your projects. So this meant the only thing that you could define with V1 inference were the targets on your projects. You couldn't do things like add tags. On the internal side of NX, this was also a little bit confusing, and it was never more stable. But whenever you have this, so you had overlapping API surface in this. You had a project graph processor, which we didn't talk about yet, that was introduced before the Inference APIs, and through it, you could add nodes to the graph. This feels really similar to registering a new project, but if you were to go about it that way, we didn't build the file map with that in mind, and you could end up with false cache hits and other things like that, which resulted in poor workspace performance. So how did we change that with V2? With V2, we still have 2 distinct parts, but there's no overlap between these parts, and they have very specific purposes. So now we have a create nodes function and a create dependencies function. What they do is exactly what it says. You have a create nodes function that's able to find the graph nodes based on your disk files, and a create dependencies function, which adds the edges between those nodes. So what does create nodes look like? Create nodes is a tuple. The first element in that tuple is a glob pattern that identifies that project file, and the second element is a function that takes that file and turns it into some list of nodes. This includes your projects. It includes external nodes on your graph, so things like npm dependencies. And to get a really good idea of what this looks like, if anybody is familiar with the V1 plugins, this is an excerpt from the example adapter that we have that inside of our code base that turns a V1 plugin into a V2 plugin so we can run it. So here we have a create nodes function. We take all of the glob patterns that you used to export and combine them. And then we map that to a project. And here we can see we have the project name, the root, and then we use the register project targets function from the V1 plugin to find the targets on that project. So because we're doing that, we no longer have a one-to-one mapping that's required. We're returning a map of projects to external nodes, so we can do however many projects we need to. And we can also add all of the external nodes in that one place. We've encapsulated that logic into a single method, and we can now add metadata to that project. And I'll show a little bit of that later. So one thing to note here is with this, it's possible for multiple projects, or multiple plugins rather, to identify the same project in your workspace. If this happens, we merge the configurations that were identified for that project. You can already see this behavior in how we handle package JSON scripts in your workspace. So if you have a project JSON and a package JSON for a project, the scripts become targets, but the NX targets are also there. It's because they're merged. Additionally, the generators property, which lets you set generator defaults per project, is merged. Tags and implicit dependencies on that project are also merged. Everything else that can't be merged, so things like the source root, anything that's a literal, is overridden by whatever last identified the project. And our built-in plugins run last. So this is important. That means that whatever's in project JSON will always be true for NX, whereas if it's from a plugin, it can be overwritten. So for an example, we're going to look at how we can add a plugin that registers a spell checking target. Okay, so this repo is a pretty simple repo. It's package-based. We have an is-even package and an is-odd package. There's no project JSONs. We have a package JSON in each that has a build and a test target. And right now, if we do NX show project is even, we can see that it has a test target and a build target, but nothing else aside from this release target that's related to what James was talking about later. So if we want to go about registering a spell checking target, we might want to do that for the readmes in the repo. So for example, if we have number here that's misspelled, and I have an IDE plugin so we can see that it recognizes that it's misspelled, but there's no way for NX to run that and tell us. So what we can do is create a plugin, and we're going to do that under Tools. Okay. And in this case, we're not adding any executors, or we're not adding any generators. So this plugin can be as simple as a TypeScript file. So that's why I didn't use a generator to create it in this case. So, and in this, we're just going to be exporting our create nodes function. So we can do export const create nodes. And we can pull in the type from devkit. Okay, so in here, we need a tuple. And in this case, we're registering the target for any project that has a README. So for our pattern here, we're just going to do */readme.md. And for our function, we get the file that was found and a context. So first thing we need is the name of the project. And in this case, we're going to just derive that based on the file path. If you have a project JSON, that name will always be taken. Since this repo doesn't, currently the package JSON name gets overwritten. That's something we're looking into polishing up a little bit. So in this case, we're just going to take the name of the directory that it's in. the string. Okay, and what we are returning here looks very similar to what workspace JSON used to look like for those familiar with it. So we get projects, and in our projects, we have an object that has that name property. And in here, we need a root for our project. So we're just going to use the directory name again of that file. And we need some targets. So in this case, we are just registering the target for the code check thing. So what we can do here is do a target called spell check. We can add a command to that target, and we can run cspell on the file that we found. Okay. So at this point, we can register that with an X. And to do that, we can just add a plugins property here. And we can point to that file, souls/plugins/spellcheck.ts. Okay. There we go. That gets rid of the TypeScript error. So now, if we run nx reset to make sure that plugin is loaded, and we show nx show project is odd, so now we can see we have a spell check target on that project that was registered because of the README file. So the way that we identify projects when we're merging them isn't even necessarily based on the name. It's actually based on the root of that project. So as long as the roots match, the target will show up on that project versus being a new project. And we can see if we were to run nx run mini spell check, nx can run it. We can see it found 3, and it had errors. So in this case, our errors were that the root readme has intele, which is an unknown word, demo app, which is an unknown word, and there's our misspelled number in the is even. So in this case, our executor doesn't have a fix or anything, so we can't rerun it to fix it, but we at least know where our errors are, and we could fail a CI check. So the other part of this API is createDependencies. I'm not going to have a live demo for this because it's a little bit more involved. But the big thing to know is this is the replacement for Process Project Graph in existing plugins. It's a little more constrained. You can't do everything that Process Project Graph could do, but there are good reasons for that. So like I said, you can't add nodes because there's a different place to add nodes now. The context object that createDependencies gets is a little bit different, but it's mostly the same. And there's a good reason for that difference. So previously, FileMap and files to process had no way to reference files that weren't part of a project. This meant that if a dependency came from that, there was no way to cache that dependency, and things were a lot slower. Now you can look at files to process, look at the non-project files, and add dependencies based on them to make sure they get processed in between runs, instead of having to recalculate them every time. So like I said, we can't add new nodes to the graph with createDependencies. Makes sense, it's in the name. But because of that, we now have 100% confidence at the time your plugin runs that every node in the graph already exists. This is a huge deal. It makes sure that you're not encountering errors because of nodes not existing yet and things like that. But it does mean that we can't have a simple adapter that goes from Process Project Graph to create dependencies like we do for create nodes in Project Inference. So, and this is kind of what I was saying. With Process Project Graph, our recommended pattern used a project graph builder. And with that builder, we just returned an updated graph. The problem with this is we can do anything on that graph. We can't do that anymore, but there's good reasons for it. So if you are a community plugin author and you wanted to maintain support for V1 and V2, so that way you're not losing out on NX version support, you can still do that. NX will always use V2 if it's available and you're on version 16.9 or higher, because that's when it landed. And then prior to 16.9, it doesn't know about the V2 plugin, so it will read your V1 plugin just fine. The way we recommend doing that is via some wrapper in your plugin. So we know that you can adapt your create nodes from your V1 plugin config. I've shown how we do that, but you can also inline that in your code base if you want to stick around. And while you can't do that to go from a project graph processor to create nodes, you can go the other way. It's really easy to build a project graph processor that's createDependencies. If you call your createDependencies function, you can really easily take each of those dependencies and feed it to the project graph builder to build the new project graph. And then you can just export both, and whatever NX can use, it will use. So this is what I'm doing in NX.NET. I've always strived to have a pretty wide version range compatibility there. Real quick, I'm going to show what that looks like. So for NX.NET, in the create nodes function, we can see that I'm using the project file patterns export from the V1 plugin and the V1 plugin register target projects method to build up that create nodes. Additionally, since we have access to more stuff here now, instead of just supplying targets, I'm able to tag every project with NX.NET. So this means whenever I'm trying to find the projects that are related to the plugin, it gets a lot easier. And that's not a tag that the user can go in and remove because they don't want it there. On the createDependencies side, like I said, you can't really adapt createDependencies to your V1 plugin. So here we have a createDependencies function that looks at all the files to process, finds the ones that are relevant to C# dependencies, grabs them and returns them. So our project graph processor becomes grabbing those dependencies with modified context, and then just for every dependency it finds, we add it. It's a relatively simple function that could probably be made into a util, but it's not available as a util currently. So on our side, we do have some next steps. Right now, the V2 APIs are still marked as experimental. The V1 plugin APIs never made it out of experimental. That's not what we want to happen for these. So we're going to mark them as stable at some point, but we're still figuring some things out. Additionally, after these are stable and the V1 APIs finish a deprecation period, they will be removed. So plugin authors should migrate to these APIs eventually. And that's kind of the next steps for you all, is check out the new APIs, try them, provide feedback. Like I said, they're still experimental, but we don't want them to stay that way. Okay, so there's my contact information. The slides are on my website, craigory.dev. There's a tab for speaking and presentations if anybody wants to go check them out. But that's my talk.
Right.